This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans. Welcome back to Transparency, everyone. We have Corinna with us today, doing a bit of a crossover here. I think most people know you from the Heterodorx podcast you do with Nina Paley. Speaking of, this is a pronoun safe space. Yeah, so anyway, Corinna's here today. She's going to tell us her story about originally transitioning back in the 90s. And then I think you kind of clued into the dangers of gender ideology and kind of became one of the early gender critical, as it were, transsexuals. So yeah, we can talk about all that. Where do you want to start?
Well, if nobody has heard of me yet, then maybe if I give a little background, that might give them some context.
Be great.
So my name is Corinna, and I transitioned when I started what was back then called the real life test. I started that when I was 18 years old, started hormone replacement therapy at 18, and had what was then called sex reassignment surgery at 19. And then for about 10 years or 15 years or so, I managed to live more or less without having trans stuff be part of my day-to-day. So we used to call that stealth, although I look at some old photos of me and I think there's probably a few people who had some suspicions. And then about 10 years ago, I started becoming interested in the schism that's between feminism and the trans community. And I started blogging a little bit in order to try to work out some of these issues. My fundamental principles are very free speech oriented. And so one of the things that was happening at the time is that trans activists were organizing in order to shut down the conferences that women were having to talk about feminism. My thought was that even if I don't agree with what they're saying, that in a world that is pluralistic, and by that I mean that we respect each other's rights to meet and talk with people who are like-minded, then it's not correct for us to try to shut down those types of conferences, but we should support them because we would want reciprocity. If we were having those sorts of conferences, we would not want people to shut us down. We would see that as unjust. So I started writing on that topic, and it turns out that was extremely divisive. And when the dust settled, I realized that I would much rather support feminists on the issue than the trans activists who were trying to shut down speech. And that caused me to be a little bit more open to thinking more about some of the feminist issues. And one day a feminist asked me, I'm sorry, I'm giving like the whole background. One day a feminist asked me, like, why do you have to identify as a trans woman instead of just being what you are, which is a man who's had some unusual experiences and a unique perspective? And I was like, that's a really fantastic question. And I processed that for a number of days. And I was like, yeah, I guess if I recognize that I'm different from other men and that's okay, that doesn't mean that I have to try to be like other men. And I can still retain the parts of myself that are me without having to be in denial about what I am. So I started to write about that a little bit more, which everybody loved and understood and accepted instantly. And that was the end of the story. There was never any more conflict about it. No, I'm just kidding.
I got your cat's looking very majestic behind you in the sun.
He is a king.
All right, sorry, go on.
Yeah, it's really pathetic that my cat brings more male energy to my house than I do. So yeah, it turns out that is not a very well accepted viewpoint in the trans community, and I found myself increasingly marginalized by people. They wouldn't even talk to me, and it's still like that today for the most part in the trans community. There are a few exceptions, which I do appreciate people being able to break the wall of silence, even if it's just in private conversations. But for the most part, I am persona non grata within the trans community, and I've lost many, many nights of sleep. No, I haven't. Those people really need to evolve a little bit.
What year was it when you started speaking out about that and kind of embracing, being male and speaking about your issues with the trans movement? What year was that?
Properly 2013.
Okay. Yes, you were definitely alone then.
Yes, so I will shout out one of the people who came before me and wrote a little bit on the issue on Tumblr, and that was somebody who is called Snowflake Especial. But I was probably the first person on the trans side on Twitter who spoke about it, and then there were more people who came along afterwards.
I think I remember you saying that that Mishfest was one of the pivotal moments for you, and I don't remember exactly how that story went. I think someone invited you to go, or
so I was invited to go back when I was in my 20s, and I checked it out, and I saw that it was woman-only space, and I thought, there are probably technicalities that where I should come up with an excuse and not attend. And it was thinking about Mishfest again in 2012 that sort of spurred my interest in trying to resolve the differences between feminism and the trans community. That was really me reminiscing one day, going, well, why is it that there's, because I knew about Camp Trans. So Michigan Women's Music Festival was a woman-only multi-day event that was on private land in Michigan, where women had talks together. They had music acts that would come in. They would do different sorts of women's things, and by that I don't, I'm trying to put a big box in like put everything in a big box, because that means a lot of stuff, just things that men were not involved in. And if for whatever reason men would need to come to the land while the festival was going, then they would create barriers or space around so that the women and the men wouldn't mix while the men were doing whatever they needed to, like if they needed to service things on land. And the trans people, the trans women, were all upset about this, and so they started camping out outside of the festival, and they would try to sneak in, and that created a lot of bad blood. And I was just one day in 2012, I was thinking about how all that had been the pattern, and I wanted to learn more about what the feminist point of view was, so that I could try to resolve it with what was going on with trans women. Because at the time, if I went back 10 years from today, this is 2022, if I went back 10 years from today, I would say, oh, women and trans women have so much in common. We face similar oppression from the patriarchy, and we get treated in similar ways in society, and it's uphill for both of us, and we have so much in common. I just don't understand why there's animosity between us. And that only took about a year for me to be like, oh shit, now I know why there's animosity. And it's because the trans people are extremely aggressive about inserting themselves into women's doing and women's spaces.
I only recently learned that a lesbian couple and their son actually died. They were murdered in relation to that conflict. I think Aaron, it was you that told me about that, and I looked it up, and I hadn't realized that how bad it got.
By a friend of theirs. So it's not just that. So the murderer's name is Dana Rivers, and by the way, I've met Dana Rivers. It wasn't only that Dana Rivers was angry and killed them. He knew them and had an ongoing relationship with them, and there was just some trigger that he killed them at some point.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't actually directly to do with the conflict. I thought it was a case of they're opposing his being at Mitch Fest, and that was his retaliation. That wasn't the case. It was they were okay.
That's not my understanding.
Oh.
So I'm not an expert on the case. So I if I'm relaying details that are not correct, then that's on me. But my last understanding of it is that they knew him.
Okay. Yeah, I think the article that I read didn't. I don't think it mentioned that they had known each other, but I think they had framed it as it was a conflict somehow over Mishfest.
Well, it wouldn't be a surprise to me if they had an argument about it. That wouldn't be a shock.
So what next?
What next? That is secret plans. No, it is finally time in America, for there to be some attention paid by politicians to what is happening in the gender clinics to adolescents. And so what's next is to help facilitate conversations between the people who understand what the current state of the medicine is and the people who are able to provide some sort of regulatory oversight. So that is what is next.
There was just an article that I've been posting on social media. It just came out today of reporting on Dr. Marcy Bowers stating at, I think it was like a conference or a talk, stating that every single child that she has worked with as a surgeon who had been on puberty blockers has zero sexual function and zero ability to have an orgasm.
Yep, they're being excluded from one of the most important human experiences.
So every single one?
She said 100% of the clients that she's aware of through her practice who had been started on puberty blockers, from the
Tanner stage 2.
Tanner stage 2 has zero sexual function.
Jesus. Oh.
So they're like perfect little dolls. They never have to be sullied. How about that?
It's insane that this continues.
Yeah, I don't know how they can continue to say that it's a perfectly harmless, reversible, intervention when we're hearing this evidence, like we're hearing about children being permanently harmed and damaged. Bone health. Like there's a number of reports from which clinic is it? The Swedish clinic that that said that has now announced that they're aware of several children who were medically harmed as a result of puberty blockers, mostly with bone density. Teenagers getting osteoporosis.
Which that's not something that you can just drink more milk to get rid of. That's something that is a very deep damage, very serious.
And it is different because the activists argue, well, they've been giving this to kids with early onset puberty, but that's very different because puberty is a time when certain physiological processes happen, like bone density. So the bone density that you have as an adult was built up during adolescence. And so if you interrupt certain pathways at their developmentally appropriate time, it's not like you can just reverse that pause button and that all just miraculously happens. Like you've missed now that window of a critical time of bone density happening.
Yes. And I think sometimes about how I had HRT started when I was 18, and that although I believed that I was an adult at the time, because legally that was the case, it took a number of years before I understood that your body continues to mature through adolescence into your 20s. So I wonder what I may have done to myself by starting transition so early.
Yeah, we do tend to think of puberty and adolescence as sort of ending around 17, 18 mark, and legally at 18 you're an adult, but that's really not the case. I mean, our bodies and our minds continue to mature, into our 20s, and even without what we childhood transition. So many people now are transitioning in their late teens and early 20s, before that actual, maturation occurs. And that's on the people who are, legally capable of consenting to that kind of healthcare. And I don't think we talk about that enough either. It's like not just the yeah, the rarer trans kids, as it were, but those, adult teenagers who are able to take this decision into their own hands when they're not really able to.
Well, let's be real for a second. What do you think should be the minimum age before somebody should be allowed to medically transition?
Throw me in the fire here.
I'll throw us all in the fire because I think we should all answer it.
Well, I've heard the age 25 being thrown around because of the emotional brain development, the cognitive development, that it seems to mature around age 25. But I would add the caveat that that really depends on actual informed consent, which means having all of the evidence presented to people in an honest way, including outcomes and complication rates. And there's so much that is hiding behind a veil, that unless we have access to that honest information about what all of this is about and the implications of that in terms of our lifetime, it's not informed consent at any age.
Why is it not informed consent at any age?
Because you have to have all of the information for it to be informed consent. Otherwise, you're missing the informed part.
To me, that suggests that there are no actions that we can take without being considered informed if we don't have all the data. And we live in a world with a lot of uncertainty. And if the only way that we could make decisions for ourselves is if we had all of the data that was possible, and that there was someone else to keep us from making those decisions until they were satisfied that we had all of that data, we wouldn't be able to do anything.
It's true. I mean, there's still a lot that we don't yet know about transition, but the active hiding of some of that information, I think, is what I'm most concerned about. I mean, we could still be informed of the available data, knowing that there's still a lot that we don't yet know.
What's your answer to your question, Corinna?
My answer. Oh, do you want me to go second or last? I see what you're doing. I'll go second. I'll go second.
I'm weaseling.
No, it's fair. You sounded like you're on the precipice of answering, though.
So, because I do lean towards 25 as well, just because what we know of cognitive development, and 25 is basically, the age at which where our brains have fully formed into adulthood. Obviously, there's so much aging, there's so much maturing that happens well after that, and there are plenty of people, especially like with the fertility question. Let's say so many especially young women, like in the 25, 26. There's no way I want children. That like just off, and then they get into the 30s, and that biological impulse is like procreate, and that suddenly changes. Like it. So I don't know how to answer that question, just because I don't know. So you could say 18 because they're legally an adult. That's when you can legally consent to other, medical interventions for yourself. With transition, though, it's just it's too gray. I've successfully weaseled.
No, that sounds like a good answer. So what's the next question then?
The thing is, though, like there are vulnerable adults, and that's the part that maybe we don't always talk about, is just because someone reaches a certain age doesn't mean that they're not still vulnerable in some way and don't have the capability of consenting in some way.
Well, and with the overlap of autism spectrum disorders and gender dysphoria or seeking transition, I mean, people on the spectrum tend to mature later than everybody else, right? And so, if so a 25-year-old with autism is not a 25-year-old, neurotypical individual when it comes to the ability to think of the the consequences of your actions.
Well, it sounds to me like that age is only one part of the formula then. competency must be another part of it. So I'll answer, and I'll try not to weasel. But I will say that there is a line that we have to draw somewhere where we permit people to become accountable for their own actions. And depending on what that action is, most of those actions are age 18. You can get a tattoo. You can, I don't know what else can you do at 18? Buy pornography, but that doesn't seem like a very...
Join the military.
Yeah, join the military. And at 21, there are other responsibilities that you can assume, like being able to purchase alcohol. And I think cigarettes now are age 21 in some places.
Yeah, but that's all specific to the U.S. Not all specific to the U.S., but like, you know, in most European countries, you can drink at 18.
Yes.
Yeah.
So depending on where you are, 18, 21, those are ages that we say, regardless of how competent you seem to be at an individual level, we are going to say at a social level, we're going to permit you to become responsible for your actions at this point. So I would say that I would set the age at 18. However, that the practice of informed consent only before having access to hormones or especially surgery is not something that we should agree with. There are two parts of this, in my opinion. The first is what constitutes informed consent is laughable in a lot of cases. I don't know if you saw any of the documents from the Helen Weberly trial. It's not a trial, it's a tribunal in the UK. Very short background. Helen Weberly is a doctor, along with her husband, who essentially
gender GP
provide hormones basically to people who ask with very little qualification through the mail, through remote. So you have a Zoom session with the doctor who talks to you for a little bit and does an assessment in a virtual assessment and makes a decision to whether or not she is comfortable providing hormone prescriptions based on just that. So she was accused of not performing her duties according to the standards of care for WPATH, and that she also failed to provide the standards of care for the 2009 guidelines for the Endocrine Society. And the tribunal said, well, we think these are outdated. We think that the University of California, San Francisco has the more modern standards of care, which is informed consent. And that if the patient says that they understand the side effects of the medication, then that is the only thing that is standing between them and a successful prescription. And in practice, what this turns out to be, so if you follow what WPATH, SOC7 says about informed consent, an aspect of informed consent, according to WPATH, is that the physician, the doctor, the clinician, needs to be convinced that the patient has a complete understanding of the risks and drawbacks of the procedure that they're considering. Okay, so that sets on the physician, hey, you need to get to know this patient well enough to talk to them about what the side effects are going to be and to get feedback from them that they know what it is. Like, you need to know your patient. What informed consent turns out to be in practice is, here's a piece of paper that has the side effects and the complications that can happen from what you're asking for. Please sign at the bottom. Okay, it's signed. That's informed consent. I gave you a piece of paper that has the symptom or the complications and side effects. You said that you read it. Hell if I know if you did or not, but you signed and said that you did. Therefore, now I'm going to give you testosterone or estrogen or double mastectomy or orchiectomy. And it's completely according to the University of California, San Francisco standards of care because you signed a piece of paper. So when we have a regime that says that anybody any teenager who can sign a piece of paper can also have permanent surgical effects. There is essentially no adult in the room. There's no oversight, and there's nobody who cares about that teenager or that young person who is there advocating for that person to receive the best care. What you have is a relationship between somebody whose mind is still maturing into adulthood. They're not really an adult in the way that somebody who's 30 or 40 is, who wants something desperately because their friends have it, they are missing out on it, and they truly, genuinely believe that what is keeping them from achieving themselves or achieving their authentic self is that medicine or that surgery. So that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is somebody who gets paid to write a prescription. And that the thing that they are worried about, that clinician, what they're worried about is the insurance provider being able to pay that claim. That's what they care about. The person who's coming in, the teenager who's seeking the surgery or who's seeking the hormones, that's all secondary because there's going to be another one after that kid. The really important thing is to maintain the relationship with the insurance provider. And the only thing that the insurance provider is looking for is a piece of paper that says informed consent at the top and is signed by the patient on the bottom. So there is something huge missing in this relationship, which is any individual, and this is normally parents, but between parents being pushed out by the kids, because that's part of the gender ideology, is get rid of the family that doesn't love you and come to your glitter family. That's one side. Or the parents who have been, I was going to say brainwashed, maybe there's a nicer way of saying it, convinced. Let's say parents who've been convinced that this is the only thing that can save their kids. In either case, you don't have somebody who is really focused on the healthcare outcomes, realistic healthcare outcomes of the teenager. So I would say, going back, what age? I would say 18 if there is somebody who is able to properly assess the competency of the individual who is seeking the treatment.
Makes sense. When you said the parents have been convinced, so one thing that I keep going back to is it's going to be the parents that kind of put an end to this, because in the past it was always just adult people outside of their parents' care seeking transition, but now there's a lot of young people obviously being transitioned, and their parents are deeply invested in the health and well-being of their children, obviously, and so they're going to be the ones who are nickel and diming the transition process, and putting brakes on and whatnot. And you're saying that's not enough, essentially.
For somebody who is, well, let's think about the scenario. Are you talking about somebody who's 18 or under 18?
Over 18, somebody who's an adult,
over 18.
Still like their parent, they're still technically, they're technically an adult, yes, but they're over 18, they're technically an adult, but their parent is still like heavily invested, obviously, in their life at that point.
Well, that's where we run into some of these really sad scenarios right now, which is that parents know that they have children who are of the age of majority and who are seeking to have these sorts of treatments done. And that these parents know their kids are not competent yet. And there's no real mechanism for them to be part of their children's care. Even though their children might still be on their insurance, right? The parents really don't have any role right now in determining whether that child should have access to care. And I should say adult child should have access to care.
The parents are saying that they don't really have any mechanism to be involved, even if their kids are minors. Like, if parents are saying things like, I think this is going too fast. My kid has just experienced trauma, and I'm concerned that's a factor. My kid has ADHD. I'm concerned that's a factor. My kid that's never shown any signs of gender nonconformity growing up, and all of a sudden announce a trans identity. These parents are being dismissed and aren't allowed to be keepers of safety of their children.
They're being dismissed by whom, though? That's a part of the question.
Well, that's tricky because they're being dismissed by oftentimes the clinicians, but the clinicians are being influenced by the activists. So it's a bit of a chicken and an egg question, right? Who is actually driving and forcing this?
Yes. And sometimes it's the state.
And you were saying, Corinna, that obviously all the physician cares about is that insurance check. You were obviously well into this when it changed from being a I transitioned in 2011, and I paid out of pocket for my prescriptions for a few years. Do you think that's where the shift happened? It's like once insurance companies were required to cover transition treatment, do you think when, at least in the US, and Aaron, I want to hear your perspective, obviously, because you guys have nationalized healthcare, so it's going to look differently. But Corinne, do you recall, do you think the massive uptick in all this transitioning, one hand of it obviously is the social contagion, well, again, chicken and egg. But I'm wondering, is that when the skyrocket of transitioning happened from your perspective, is once there was, insurance money to be made from?
This is a fantastic question, and I don't have any answers on that. It's one of those correlations is not causation topics, because we know that there has been a lot of lobbying on behalf of these trans organizations on insurance companies to supply coverage for transition-related care. But whether the availability of money for that care is what caused people to become more interested in seeking it, I don't know.
What's interesting is that explosion in numbers, most of us have seen that graph where it's fairly stable numbers, and then around 2015 is when we started to see this really rapid increase, and that seems to be the case everywhere, regardless of whether you had a socialized healthcare system or not, or whether there was insurance coverage or not. So from state to state, or province to province, or country to country, those numbers seem to all be fairly consistent in terms of how that curve happened. So it doesn't seem to be correlated with what system or what country you're living in.
It's Western, though.
Yeah.
This isn't happening at the same rate in some other country that's not a Western country. I was going to pick on a country there for a second, and I thought whichever one I pick on, it's going to make somebody mad. But this is mostly a Western phenomenon.
Yeah, it is. But I think it was around, was it 2014 that that transition healthcare? Because I'm wondering, so much of this starts here in the U.S. and radiates elsewhere. So I am wondering if the trend, that boom that happened elsewhere was related to, because obviously, so much of this is Tumblr, of course, but so everybody's all connected, obviously, online, absorbing the same information, picking up the same social trends. And anyway, I'm kind of wondering, though, if it was related to the U.S. covering, what used to be something that you had to pay for out of these surgeries and everything, had to pay for out of pocket. Suddenly, insurance are providing them. Suddenly, more and more teenagers or adults, but young people are having these surgeries in the U.S. because they're being paid for, whereas before you had to pay out of pocket. And again, it's just part of the exposure of it all could be universal to happen, basically extend to countries that already covered it. But again, with the I'm not articulating this very well, but I think you know what I'm saying here.
That sounds like you could get a research grant to answer that.
I'll try. Aaron, what was it like over there? Because you guys, how long has transition been covered? With your
It's
healthcare?
different. It's different from province to province. So the federal government gives the provinces money for healthcare, but it's up to the provinces how they spend that and the design of their health care services. So, I mean, even between British Columbia and Alberta, which is one province over, Alberta, you have to see a psychiatrist to do the hormone readiness assessment, whereas in BC, they're trying to get, as many just primary care physician, so family doctors and nurse practitioners to do that assessment, to decrease the barriers as much as possible. So it's really different, but we've had, and coverage for which procedures are covered is different from province to province as well. But we've had full coverage for surgeries in BC for a long time now, like almost a decade, I think.
Oh, but that wasn't the case when you transitioned then.
When I transitioned, we didn't have coverage for chest surgery yet, and genital surgeries weren't really covered either. Yeah, genital surgeries weren't covered either, but it's been in the last like 10 years that everything started to be covered, and we have, but we didn't have until recently, we didn't have a surgeon in BC that could do any of the genital surgeries. We had a number that were doing the double mastectomies.
These are life-saving procedures. I like that there's these little in jokes that we can tell each other. that if you don't know, somebody listening is going to be like, "Wow, why did Corinna say those are life-saving?" No, then we start laughing.
Well, it makes me wonder, like, so they're saying, with this increase, that's just because there's less stigma. So everyone who's truly trans is now feels at liberty to transition. So you're telling me that with a 4,000% increase, are you saying that 4,000%, those people that make up that 4,000%, were they all dying before? Like, so, I mean, it just doesn't, the narrative just doesn't add up when you try to piece all the information together.
Not a single bit of it does. And this is a rabbit hole, so I'm reluctant to even say it, but you have to understand sexual orientation, how that plays a role in who's transitioning.
Go down the rabbit hole.
Let's go down the rabbit hole, because we've been talking about that quite a bit.
All right, so let's first agree that the populations between males who want to transition and females who want to transition, that there's differences between them. So whether you are somebody who believes the Blanchard model for males who are trying to transition, where the majority of them are heterosexual, autogynephilic, and the small minority of them are homosexual, transsexual, which that's not a model that applies very well to females who are trying to transition. And then on the female side, you have rapid onset gender dysphoria. And I guess there are some women who are transitioning to men who identify as having autoandrophilia. And then the rather sizable number of females who are attracted to females who are transitioning. So that's they look differently on the male side versus the female side. So that's one place to start.
And that's changed on the female side, because I mean, Blanchard told us that the reason why they never did a typology on the female to male transition was that for decades they only saw one kind of person showing up to clinics, and that was butch lesbians. So they didn't really feel a need to investigate that further and try to make sense of the differences they were seeing in the population, because it was just one population until recently.
Until the ROGD population emerged, right?
Which is one other reason why it doesn't make sense that lack of stigma is what's opening all of this up to transition. Is that doesn't explain why we would see a completely new cohort of people.
And the ratio of males to females upending, doesn't explain that.
What do you think the ratio is right now?
I think it's definitely shifting all the time, right? It seems like the rapid onset in boys is kind of on the uptick, I don't know what the ratio is.
I think in the graph I saw in 2019, the ratio was about 75% females, natal females. I think the males are starting to catch up a little bit, so it might be closer to, or do you think it's still 75% females?
I think it's more than 75% females personally.
Really? Okay.
So there's one population that we haven't talked about yet, which is the, and I guess this makes it pretty interesting in a way. Who is trans, right? Are the non-binary people trans? Like, what is a trans? You know what? I'm gonna go across the world and I'm going to interview people from all sorts of cultures and ask them, what is a trans?
Like, what is a Walsh guy who's going around? What is a woman?
That's right.
What is a
I'm
woman?
gonna do a follow-up. What is a trans? Get a microphone and just go out on the street and say, hey, what's a trans? I bet I'll get some interesting answers. Are the non-binaries trans, right?
I do think it's funny how we're in our circles of like where we're kind of on the crossover between the trans space and the gender critical space. Obviously, we ideologically are much more aligned with the latter, but a lot of the ones who are completely opposed to all trans people are basically like, oh, you only basically there's no such thing as true transsexuals. You think they're the true transsexuals, and it's like no. I mean, obviously we use it as a joke, but like, no, we don't think that there's such a thing as a true transsexual.
It's a joke. Wait, so when I say that I am the only true transsexual, that's not a joke. I'm the only one. I'm sorry. Let me actually let me be a good guest. I am the only true male to female transsexual. All y'all's got to.
You can't claim our experience. Yeah,
I can't claim your experience. That's all on y'all. But I'm the only true male to. Okay, great.
Allowed.
Yeah, you know that there's like a movement, a true transsexual movement. Yeah, did you know that there always has been? There used to be a group who called themselves as having Harry Benjamin syndrome.
Interesting.
Harry Benjamin was one of the progenitors of the trans medicalization, and what is called WPATH now used to be the Harry Benjamin Society Standards of Care, or something like that. And there were a group of true transsexuals who called themselves as having women with Harry Benjamin syndrome.
Interesting.
I mean, we still have that. It's not obviously the Harry Benjamin standards, but what are called the trans medicalists or the true scum, which I have very much used to be. I used to believe that there were the fakers and the people who really were trans, and I was of course one of the really trans people. So I mean that still exists, and you see it in full force.
We can't even get people to admit that gender dysphoria is necessary to be trans.
Is it?
I don't think so.
No.
I don't think people should be having surgery unless they really do have some sort of anxiety or something really, really horrible feelings about their body that surgery shouldn't even be on the table. And I guess that raises the question of whether surgery should be on the table for anybody, but particularly if you don't have any body dysmorphia, you should not be having parts of your body changed around just to meet the fashion, right? If you want fashion, go to H&M. Don't go to the gender doctor.
Why do we think that is happening?
Fashion.
Fashion.
Well, I mean,
to the left.
I know that there's always been debates about, what is the true transsexual? Is that, the homosexual subtype or the AGP subtype? But I mean, setting that aside for a second, at least, even within the homosexual cohort, I think there were different reasons that people were driven to transition. I think for some it was, let's say, a butch lesbian who is experiencing a lot of homophobia, who doesn't have necessarily the experience of gender dysphoria, but just feel like because of homophobia and how they naturally kind of present to the world. They just feel like my life would be easier if I took hormones and I passed as the opposite sex, and now I'm free of discrimination. So that's one reason. Yeah, so
Xander Keeg, he's explained that exactly.
He's talked about that, and he's not alone in that. There are people that do that, and then there are people who are also usually gender nonconforming homosexuals who want to transition because of the gender dysphoria, but probably also there's probably some overlap between those two groups. I'm sure that the people who had actual gender dysphoria, like I did, homophobia was still a factor. The society's response to gender nonconforming people was a factor.
I've heard a lot of, or not a lot, but I've been hearing it a bit, is the homosexual, transsexual, male to female transitioners. A lot of them are saying that they didn't have gender dysphoria, as in they didn't have any problem with their physical body. They didn't feel any discontentment with their physical body. It was all basically about partnerships and just how basically I can't succeed, socially and relationally as a highly effeminate man. So it's going to be more beneficial to me to live as if I were a woman. And it's not so much about, oh, my body is alien. So it's always been, these different motivators.
I've heard the white picket fence thing thrown around a lot, that they wanted the white picket fence, sort of the normal sort of heteronormative life that they didn't feel that they could achieve as a highly effeminate gay man.
So are non-binary trans? Is that a question?
Did we answer that for you?
we didn't go back to that, did we? I'm trying to get a non-binary guest on Heterodorx because I really want somebody who's not really defensive about it either, because I really want to figure out what are the parameters of somebody who's non-binary. Because if the only parameter is that it's somebody who identifies as non-binary, then even Christianity has tighter membership requirements than that.
Do you think it's possible to be gender critical and non-binary?
No, not at all. But no, that's an antithesis of gender critical.
But there's
Katie Herzog asked if you can be conservative and non-binary, and they put it to the guests of the podcast Blocked and Reported. It's like, do we have any listeners who are both conservative and non-binary? And somebody reached out to them. Katie interviewed him, and it basically turned out that he's basically just uncomfortable with male and female social roles, and therefore claims to be non-binary. And that's like what it all drills down to.
Right, but he was otherwise just a gay guy.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, geez, why didn't feminists think of that years ago when they wanted to break down gender?
Haven't I heard over and over and over that feminism is for women? So, guys have to come up with something now. So that's, I guess, non-binary is for guys.
Okay.
Non-binary is feminism for men.
No, transitioning is feminism for men.
We're gonna make people happy.
Tell us about your Washington Post article that was published recently.
Okay, so I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post. This is something that's a little unusual because the topic of it was, would I wish I had known about transition when I was 19? And the origin of this letter, of my op-ed, was I was in correspondence with a woman whose son was 19 years old and transitioning. And she was asking for some advice, and I thought, well, I don't know this man, because he's over 18, and as we all know that that's the age of majority. And I thought, if I was going to send a letter back to myself when I was that age, what would I want to tell myself? And I wrote a letter to myself and sent that to her as my email response. And then a few weeks after that, I contacted Pamela Peresky and said, hey, I wrote this letter to a mother whose child is going through this, and after reading it, I thought maybe it would be of general interest. Can you give me some advice on what I should do with it? And she helped me edit it. And the version that she helped me edit is on appearance on her Substack right now. If you want to check out the letter as it appeared in the edited form, that is on Pamela Peresky's Substack, which is called Habits of a Free Mind. And I'll send you the link so that you can link it if you'd like. But that is the mature form of the letter. So then Pamela helped me find some outlets that might be interested in it. And an editor from Washington Post was interested in it, and he said, we do not print that form of like that framing that you used, which is the letter to yourself. We won't print an op-ed like that. Can you completely rewrite it into a different form? I said, yes, I can do that. And I produced way too many words that would fit on the page. It was supposed to be 800 words, and I submitted 1,300, and he said, that's too many. And I chopped it down to 1,000, and I said, would you pretty please help me get it down? I didn't say pretty please. I said, would you please help me get it down to the word count that you're looking for? So there was some context that was removed from there, that when it eventually made it into the Washington Post, there were some things that were missing some context that I think would have helped some of my more critical, some of the more critical feedback I received would probably have been addressed by a little bit more context. So the letter that is on Habits of a Free Mind should provide some more of that context.
And that criticism you got, where was that coming from?
Well, so there was a line that said that I transitioned because I wanted to have relationships with men. And the fact is that that is like one piece of the puzzle for me, but it's not the whole piece. The piece that I wasn't able to get in there very well is how alienated I felt from masculinity because of all the abuse I had received growing up. So between the fact that I was developing crushes on some of my classmates, male classmates, and the fact that I didn't feel like I could be included in anything that was happening with boys at all, I really wanted to transition because it would make me feel like I was a normal person. And that goes a little bit back to what you were saying, Aaron, about if you're not a gender conforming person, then transition seems like an appealing way of becoming normal in society, because otherwise it's extremely hostile. So yeah, the Washington Post left that context out, but okay. That made a number of individuals who are very aligned with their identity of being homosexual transsexuals mad, because they know that I have dated a woman in the past, and as you were alluding to earlier, that some homosexual transsexuals say that they have never had gender dysphoria. So they read that and they thought that I was appropriating their identity, which, okay. You know, I'm not part of the identity defender squad, so I get people who get mad about that, but they got mad at me about it. And I'm also a computer programmer, and as you can see by my garbage man outfit that I'm wearing today with the cap and the sideburns and the cigar that I smoke between the times that I speak, that I'm sort of a brick, and so they want me to admit that I'm an autogynephile, and I've done a lot of soul searching over the last month, and I think at the end of the day, I'm just a really shitty gay transsexual is I think probably the right place to land on.
It's so I can't believe you got of all the quadrants. I was expecting you to get criticism for that piece. I didn't expect the strict Blanchardians to be where it came from. That's weird.
Well, it wasn't just that piece. It was that Heterodorx had on as a guest J. Michael Bailey.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I just started listening to that. I'm looking forward to hearing the rest.
It's a good episode.
So they were triggered, and if they listen to this, I hope they are also triggered again.
Oh man, it's a new side. Interesting.
See, this is liberating for you, Corinna, because anything you don't want to say on your podcast, because it might piss people off too much. You can come on to ours and say it.
Oh yes, I am the soul of restraint on my own podcast. A good description.
But with you, so like teenage Corinna, feeling like you didn't fit in masculinity, and you were attracted to other boys. You didn't know didn't know where to put yourself. And you came across the concept of transition that was appealing. And I'm wondering now with all these young men now detransitioning and explaining that much, they often felt a lot like you did, but then you add the element of online feminism. Because I mean, a lot of most kids or young adults who are now either trans or detransing basically grew up on Tumblr, and which is so much social justice. Well, it's all it is social justice, and it's very much men, bad, evil, oppressor. And so many of these boys feeling like you did as a teenager are like, not only do I not feel like I belong with men, I'm attracted to them, or whatever it might be. Like you just don't know how to be a man, and then you're also learning that men are evil and oppressors and rapists and just dangerous, and you don't want to be. Not only do you not feel comfortable with growing up to be a man, you now feel like you have the what is really internalized misandry, and so a further incentive. And I joked obviously earlier that transitioning is feminism for men, but that does seem to be like the perspective that a lot of these young men now coming out with their detransition stories were like, feminism told me that it was evil to be male. So yeah, the feminists are gonna hate this, but it almost seems like no, I'm never mind. I'm gonna stop right there. I'll let you go on.
Well, I think we're going to hear a lot more from that cohort on this issue, and I'm looking forward to them taking the time to play with their thoughts a little bit, or air them out, or when you have this really big, complicated puzzle in front of you that has a lot of pieces and it has a lot of trauma in it, it takes time to unpack it and look at all these little different parts and understand how they've ended up fitting together. So I think we're at the very beginning of that stage, and it's going to be traumatic because, as I've seen, some of these young detransitioners, these young men, are saying, I needed to have a more realistic view of what masculinity would be for me. And I wasn't able to develop it because I internalized this other ideology. And although there are some very positive things in feminism, it is obviously not universally beneficial to everybody, because we can hear these stories from young men who felt like, as you said, they had a lot of internalized misandry. They hated the idea that they were men. And to what extent that is attributable to feminism, I think is debatable, and it's going to be the cause of many debates from this point into the future.
And I actually want to circle back on what I had said, because I don't think it's feminism. I think it's more like this toxic bastardization of feminism that kind of takes over online spaces. Like I obviously am a believer in feminism, and but it's more like that really toxic view of masculinity that I don't think feminism itself is at fault for, but more like how that's kind of what it becomes in online spaces, let's say.
Well, I think women, like the FDMs, are getting caught in that a little bit too, in the sense that like, I'm not saying this was the case with Helena, but the phenomenon that she describes of heterosexual girls, because of the social justice framework and the narrative, that they don't want to be, it's boring to be heterosexual white girls, or boring to be heterosexual white boys. And so opting into trans in order to have more social currency. But then you hear about young FDMs saying, but then I started to actually look like a man. And now I'm a white man. It was appealing to them because trans has social currency, not really thinking it all through, thinking, well, the hormones are going to do their thing to your body and the world is going to read you as a man. And now you've lost your social currency because white men have, on the pecking order, white men have all the privilege. So it's so tricky. And I mean, I experienced some of that because I was a lesbian and a feminist too for many years. When I transitioned and started to appear male, I really had to confront my own bias about what it means to be a man in the world. And I developed a lot more empathy towards men as a result.
I'm sorry for laughing. I just, that's very serious, but I almost asked, what's it like being a man in the world? Because I transitioned at 18, and so I haven't had a good slice of it. So, like, what's your experience with it? Is it like it? I'm sorry, I'm the guest though, so I'm going to do guest privilege. It seems horrible, and there's something obviously that is stuck in my brain from the time that I transitioned that is like arrested development. That I just think of the idea of going into society and people like having to do masculinity sounds horrible, and I can't get that part out of my brain. So like, what is it for you? What is it like?
Well, it's a hard question.
Horrible, isn't it?
It's a hard question to fully articulate, but I mean, I can point to a couple of examples. I mean, there's nuances in social learning, and as much as I had gender dysphoria and had sort of this self-image as male, I mean, I wasn't socialized male. The world didn't respond to me as male. So there's just things that you can't possibly anticipate until you've experienced it. And so little examples, like I was just walking down a sidewalk one day in the gay village and minding my own business. I was just kind of window shopping, and a guy in front of me spun around and called me a faggot, and I thought he was going to punch my teeth out because I guess I was walking too close behind him. And that's just not something that I would have thought much about as female. And as male, I mean, I didn't really think much about it either until I had those experiences. So learned very quickly that your social, like your social space bubble has to be bigger as male. You can't get as physically close to people as you could when you were female. This is one example that I noticed. And emotional regulation has to be different. I mean, one is when I started taking testosterone, I don't cry as easily. I mean, I was never a big crier anyway, but I noticed that it's really hard for me to access certain emotions now as a result of testosterone. I cry for sentimental things, like if I'm watching a sentimental movie, I'm like waterworks, but I don't cry out of sadness and frustration. And so I've had to learn other ways of processing my emotions. And I find that I was never really a big demonstrative emotional person, but I do find that the range of acceptable emotions to express has narrowed, because I think women have a freedom to be a little more demonstrative with and emotional than men do, without being perceived as, I don't know, angry or overly emotional.
Unbalanced.
A lot of those reasons why I feel like transition took so well for me is, first of all, I don't like people in my personal space, so I always give a lot of space. And then I've always been quite, not emotionally expressive, and but there was a lot of like the socialization is entirely different. One thing, Aaron, I'm not sure if you noticed and didn't expect, I didn't expect it, is men actually touch each other a lot more than women do. And that's kind of, I think, something people would think the opposite of. Men very girls, women who are close friends or whatever might be like, like touch each other's arm, or I don't know, in communication. But guys, like, there's always like a, when you're greeting, when you're leaving, like there's always like a hand, like a back pat, or a like a fist bump or a handshake. There's so much touching. I don't know. It made me uncomfortable, and I didn't expect that kind of being touched so much. And I don't appreciate that. But one big difference, I think, is is the world's just harsher to men. Both men and women, right, are less warm, and you're kind of treated quite delicately when you're perceived as a woman. I'm not sure if you must have like how, like, when you were a teenager, did you feel like when you transitioned and started passing as female, that the world got softer in response to you? Because I found the opposite. Is like once people were perceiving as me as male, they were much harsher in their just communication styles. And like noticing, like, if I would smile at a woman, she would try to get away, like, rather than smiling back as she would have, if I were perceived as a woman. But so yeah, I found like that both men and women are a lot more, I think harsher is the only way I can describe it, but you're afforded much more respect. So there's those two things. It's like once I started passing as male, I felt like I was given like this kind of like almost deference, like when I would just start talking about things, and suddenly I was perceived as basically getting much more attention than I would have before. I'm taken much more seriously, and yeah, I guess it just afforded more respect than I was previously. But again, it's the harshness. So there are a lot of people who transition, who, like Aaron was saying, you take testosterone, you start masculinizing. And so a lot of these young women who want to transition because they want to be trans, they don't want to be men. And then, so on top of looking like a man, the world is treating them much more harshly, when really they just wanted to be like, have the cool rainbow point.
Uwu soft boy.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But did you find that, like, so you never lived the world as an adult man, but you were obviously, a teenage boy, and did things get, I don't know, how did the world the external perception of you change?
Transitioning for me initially felt really good, because I was able to go from being really introverted to developing friendships and relationships with people, which I struggled with so badly growing up. And it's sort of funny because in retrospect, one of the things that I could say is that as I became more mature and as I learned how to ameliorate my social awkwardness, that those two things could have been what allowed me to form relationships more easily. But it was a lot more highly correlated with my transition. And so for a long time, I assumed that that was unlocking the real me, which there's plenty of reason to doubt that that was actually what happened. But I think that it's pretty common for trans people, though, to talk about how they were socially repressed before transition, and then afterwards that they felt like they had an easier time to connect. And I guess from a gender critical perspective, one of the conclusions that you might draw is that in order to portray your gender role correctly in the way that our society is shaped right now, that there's some unnaturalness to it for some people, and that the unnaturalness of it is so severe that unfortunately transition seems to be something that allows it to be expressible. Because I don't know how to put this. I'm not Blair White. Let's just say that. I'm not trying to put myself out there as a Barbie model at all, and I would never want to. And when I was a boy, I was not particularly a swishy boy. I was just quieter and more cerebral and more introverted, and I'd much rather have a conversation with an adult, because adults were able to think about things more carefully. And I just had no ability to develop new friendships as a boy. And at the same time that I was probably figuring out how to express myself and reach out to people and be a little bit more vulnerable and trusting and get those relationships started, I was doing my transition. So it's just all conflated now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, these days transition seems to be so much about, kind of picturing in your mind this whole like persona that you curate and cultivate, and then you transition into this brand new self and a brand new identity. And I wouldn't say that my transition I experienced it quite like that. In some ways I just felt like what this does is it sort of removes a social barrier. Like I can just be myself in a way that doesn't seem to ruffle other people's feathers. Whereas as a butch lesbian, it sort of the equivalent of like the discomfort or confusion people feel when there's a trans man who's pregnant, and that causes, that incongruence causes people sort of this discomfort. As a butch lesbian, I felt like I was always doing that I was always causing people discomfort in some way, which then fed into a lot of social anxiety for me, which probably made me more socially awkward, so it was just sort of this vicious cycle. And I felt like transitioning was just a way of being myself without causing that discomfort in other people. And I mean, and I don't think, I'm not trying to build a case for transition, but that's just I think that's the purpose that it served. And I don't think it places a big, heavy medical and psychological burden on us in order to soothe other people's anxiety about gender nonconformity.
Yeah, this is really rough, because I think each of us would tell people, be very, very, very slow about transitioning. Make sure that you have as much information as possible. Question your own competency might even be a piece of advice. And then, nevertheless, we're sitting here talking about some of the positive things that we experienced, not necessarily because we transitioned, but because we are navigating the world in a way where people's expectations are starting from a different set of values than they would have been if we were just gender nonconforming, appearing as gender nonconforming individuals of our native sex.
Mm-hmm.
Fuck you, cis people. You did this to us. Is that the answer? I don't think that's the answer, but maybe that's the answer.
I have found that it's there seems to be one thing, like when I first started encountering like the gender critical perspective, and I really adopted it, excuse me. And then, reading, firsthand, it was reading all the detransitioner experiences and me trying to figure out like what is different between my experience, because so much of the gender dysphoria was the same. Like they had the same experience as I did, and then they transitioned, and for whatever reason, it wasn't a benefit to them. And one thing I'm realizing with a lot of the detransitioner stories is they were very much trying to flee themselves. Like they wanted to be somebody else entirely. And then now that they've detransitioned, they're like embracing their who they are. Like they're learning to accept themselves and actually love themselves for who they are. Whereas before they were trying to be somebody else entirely because they basically hated who they were. And that's something that I've never related to. I felt like I've always been quite like fond, I don't know, it's weird to say, but like fond of myself. Like I like the person I am. I always have. And except when I was a teenager, who likes themselves when they're a teenager, but I've always been kind of like proud, I guess, of who I am, except I had this very, intense experience of gender dysphoria where I felt that I would just feel much more comfortable if people saw me the way I saw myself, which was male. And so, I transitioned and it basically achieved that. I feel a lot differently about the whole thing now, obviously, but I feel like that's one of those things why it, and again, not to, speak so positively about transition, but it's, yeah, I feel like if you go into it kind of knowing like I'm still the exact same person. I will always be the same person. I'm just going to cosmetically look different. The world is going to interact with me differently. And, and if those things you're signing up for, then sorry, we went full circle here to who can consent to this. But I think that has a lot to do with that is knowing you will always be the exact same person. It's just how you look and how people interact with you that's going to change.
A number of people over the years have messaged me and said as though they're I don't know. They've messaged me the old saying, wherever you go, there you are. So transition doesn't give you an outlet. You're still you.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're trying to get away from you, then transition isn't going to get you away from yourself.
It's just going to give you a whole new bag of
That's right.
issues.
So that's why you need dissociative drugs.
When you guys were kids, were you able to imagine yourself as adults? Were you able to imagine a future for yourself?
No.
No.
There were no men who were modeling anything that I could see as a man that I would want to become.
I always just felt so completely foreign to the women, like the adult women in my life, like my mom, her friends, my aunts. It was like I did not relate to them at all. I related much more to the male figures in my life, and so the concept of growing up to be a woman just absolutely made no sense to me. I couldn't envision it. And then even when I was, in my mid, and I had transitioned when I was 27. But it still seemed like such a foreign idea. It seemed like this is not like I'm not. Yeah. Anyway, I just never was able to relate with womanhood, no matter how old I got. I don't know. Maybe I would have eventually outgrown it, but didn't at 27. So
I think that's where the idea of gender identity comes from. Is like I couldn't imagine myself as an adult as like growing up female. I imagined I would grow up to be a man, and so I had a very active imagination and an imaginary life, and where I imagined myself as an adult man, and this is what my life is going to look like, and then when you hit your teenage years and your body starts changing, it's like, oh shit, I'm not gonna like I've invested so many years of my life in that gender identity, to use that word in its correct sense, building up that internal sense of self that was so mismatched from reality that as a teenager it was a real crisis moment.
I don't even remember what how I envisioned the future, other than I couldn't. Just couldn't see myself being an adult woman. But I don't know if I've like kind of. I didn't plan to be an adult man though. I wasn't thinking like that. I don't know what I was thinking.
I got to point something out here because I think it's important that we acknowledge it. I think all of us are to some degree gender critical. No matter what word we use, that's sort of where we are. And we're sitting here going, oh my gosh, when I was a kid, I couldn't imagine growing up to be an adult of the sex that I am. And when I transitioned, the awkwardness kind of disappeared. And somebody listening to this would be very right to say, you are not being consistent in what you're talking about. So I feel like we ought to confront that. First of all, do you think I'm right? And second of all, should we confront that?
Not being consistent in what way?
And
Just so
consistent because we would say, oh, well, you should slow down. You should try to inhabit your body is something that I say. You should try to become more comfortable being in the world as the sex that you are before you try to transition. And transition doesn't really solve anything, and it brings with it a bunch of medical problems besides. And I wish, looking back, maybe I had thought about my options differently. And then, so that was like the first part of our conversation. Then we're like, oh my God, I can't imagine growing up and becoming a woman or becoming a man. And it was just like, I felt so awkward and out of place in the sex that I was. And when I transitioned, I was becoming who I felt more comfortable being. These are in tension with each other.
Yeah.
I don't know the thing. Okay, so I've had this conversation with a detransitioner who basically said to me, you know you're not a man, and you know that gender you know that gender ideology is all nonsense. You know this is physically bad for you. Why don't you detransition? And obviously that's a very good question, but it's like because it worked, because I feel this is the easy way out. Like I could confront my gender dysphoria, detransition, confront my gender dysphoria in a more in a more cognitive way, perhaps. But the truth is that this is really easy, and it relieved the dysphoria. It continues to relieve it's like I feel comfortable. I know long term this was probably a bad decision, but it's done the trick. But I don't. So one of my favorite reviews I've read of somebody for transparency, somebody who's like basically anti-trans people listen to it, it's not what you think, and then pro-trans people listen to it, it's not what you think. So that's what we're doing here, is like we can talk about how nonsensical it is to try to change your sex, or to think you can change sex, or to buy into the genderology of it all. But the whole point of this is to be completely honest and transparent, and that is that for me transition worked. So
I'm more concerned about the gender ideology and the impact of that and the harm that it's doing than I am the concept of people have gender dysphoria and sometimes seek treatment for it. But just going back to a couple of points, so the world being uncomfortable with gender nonconformity, I mean, that's very contextual, and we live in the world, we have certain experiences, and we do our best to respond to those experiences. And so I don't make apologies for my choice at the time, given my circumstances, but that doesn't mean that I don't want the circumstances to change. I would love for our world to be more accepting and understanding of gender nonconformity, so that is no longer a motive for some people. But I'm also a realist, and the world is what it is, and I couldn't, as a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old or even a 20-year-old, just snap my fingers and change that. But that doesn't mean that I don't want something better. Like, it doesn't mean that I think that medicalizing all gender nonconforming people is the solution to other people's discomfort with gender nonconformity.
how do you make sense of it?
Oh gosh. I think sometimes it's okay to acknowledge that you have some dissonance about your beliefs. And I think this is one of those cases where it's just something that I'm still processing. I don't have an answer. I really do believe that if I had, at a younger point in my life, had somebody who understood what I was going through and had really understood where I was likely to end up and had worked with me, that I would have been able to find some way forward that did not involve transition. But I did not have that. And I am far past the point where that would be a practical thing for me to have. So this is why when people ask if I regret transitioning, I say that I'm ambivalent, because the thing that might have helped me wasn't there. And without transitioning, I don't know where I would have ended up, but might have been in a lot worse spot. Might have been a better spot, I don't know, but it's easy for me to imagine scenarios where the lack of feeling like I had a place anywhere would have gotten me to the point where I felt so isolated that I might have just turned myself completely inside out and disappeared.
I agree with that. I would say, early intervention, I think, is key to be able to recognize and support kids. Like, I had no idea as a little kid. I mean, I would say that I had gender dysphoria from about age 3 on. As soon as I understood that there were differences between male category and female category, I automatically put myself in the male category, and I had no idea why. That was very confusing, and I knew I was making a mistake, but I had no framework for understanding, why am I making that mistake? Why am I doing that? And it seemed like a dirty secret. And that's why I went internal. Rather than being able to talk to somebody, I didn't tell anyone about it. Nobody had any idea. They saw that I was gender nonconforming. That part was clear to people, but they had no idea what my internal struggle was. And I think it would have been really helpful to have someone who understood it to come into that space and teach me what it was about and help me make sense of it, because I've spent so many years internalizing it and developing that internal sense of self, that gender identity, right? That internal sort of sense of self as male. When you have that and you've developed that and it's very firmly entrenched for many, many, many years, I think as a clinician, I'm thinking, could that do harm? Like, if someone's had that stable sense of self for 40 years, what harm could it do to try to now break that down and unravel that and replace it with something else? So in terms of ethics, I kind of think, what does the least harm at some point? But whereas if someone had intervened when I was 5, and then I wouldn't have maybe developed that, because I developed a sense of self largely out of misinformation and not understanding my experience. So ethically, as a 50-year-old, like, it would do my life and myself a lot of harm at this point to even consider detransition. When I've built an entire life, it would impact my family, it would impact my kids, it would impact everything in my life. It would be a whole nother transition at this point to undo any of this, and I think it would do me psychological harm to do that.
For sure.
Well, until you decide to finally pull the trigger, though, Aaron, and detransition, I'm not going to let you be part of the gender critical movement.
so so obviously we're considered wanting to cause harm, wanting to do violence to the trans community by trans activists, and then the radical feminist contingent say that we're endorsing the trans lifestyle by even talking about this stuff. So can't win. I honestly think that this is the honesty is all that matters. But yeah, I think it's gonna do good. But tell us about your podcast. You obviously are one half of the Heterodorx podcast. Yes. How did that come about? The TERF-Tranny alliance.
Oh gosh. Well, so I met.
Well, that's
Nina,
a different thing, but yeah.
Yeah, I met Nina back in 2019 at a feminist get together that I was crashing so that I could use the toilets there, and she and I got along pretty well, and we did an in-person talk together because she was being treated horribly by some of the people in her community, and we thought if we gave a talk at the library and talked about some of these issues, maybe people would be able to develop a little bit better insight about what we believed. And mostly it was just people who already understood where we were coming from who showed up, and then the rest of the people who like to be angry. So over the course of the pandemic, Nina and I would have virtual dinner together from time to time because people were locked down and it was a little lonely. And we had profound conversations. And they're terrible now on Heterodorx. They're just a pale reflection of what they used to be. But they're still okay. But yeah, it used to be like it was the meeting of the great minds when we didn't have an audience. But you'll just have to believe me. So Nina and I both use humor as a coping mechanism and as a way of attacking problems or ideas. Because you have to use some technique, so humor is as good a tool as any. And we use that to tackle some really complex topics on our show. So today we just spoke with the person who started the voluntary human extinction movement.
Excuse me?
There's something called the voluntary human extinction movement.
So like
So
antinatalist to an extreme?
Not necessarily, because it's voluntary. It's voluntary. So the extreme version would be cutting the balls off of a 16-year-old just because he likes to wear a dress. So not as extreme, but we find that we like having these really nuanced conversations right after I say that we cut off the balls off of a 16-year-old boy. And these conversations then with our guests really are from an unusual perspective, because there's not a lot of people who have Nina's background or my background approaching some of these issues. So it turns out that sometimes we have some interesting and bizarre conversations, which usually involve coming back around to chopping off the balls off a 16-year-old boy.
They're good conversations. They're very, they're very funny. And then also you do tackle some very interesting, issues.
I recommend if you're 16 that you not have orchiectomy. I just want to put that in the footnote.
Disclaimer.
Wait until you're 18 and competent.
Fully mature to make that decision.
Yes, or 25, depending on your jurisdiction.
All right, well, thank you so much, Corinna.
It's a pleasure being here.
Been a pleasure. It's always a fun time. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.